Dr. Evans, you'll let me know when we're ready.
We are live.
Right. Thank you very much. Dr. Evans, would you call the roll, please?
Sure. Dr. Blanton?
Present.
Dr. Bullock? She'll be just a couple minutes late. Dr. Dempsey?
Present.
Dr. Fleming?
Present.
Miss Edwards?
Happy Thursday.
Thank you. Dr. Graham? Dr. Houston?
Present.
Dr. Locklear?
Here.
Dr. Marr?
Present.
Dr. Elliott?
Good morning.
Dr. Penfield?
Present.
Superintendent Truitt? Miss Carper?
Present.
Dr. Holland?
Good morning.
And Dr. Graham just arrived. Dr. Graham, you're just in time for roll call. Dr. Holland?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Dr. Weddington is going to be a couple minutes late. Dr. Griffin?
Here.
Mr. Smith?
Present.
And Mr. Patton. We have quorum.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the November 10, 2022 monthly meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs. I am Van Dempsey, Chair of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict of interest with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. I'll now call for approval of the agenda for today's meeting. Commission members, you have had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the November 10th, 2022 meeting?
So moved, Connie.
This is Randy. Second.
Thank you both. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? The agenda is approved. Approval of the minutes. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on October 13th, 2022 are posted and have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
So moved.
Second, Anthony Grant.
Did you get that, Dr. Evans?
I did. Thank you.
Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Now, Dr. Evans and Mr. Alessandro Montanari will present the NCDPI and SBE updates. Dr. Evans?
Thank you, Chair Dempsey. This month for the State Board, the Pepsi report for this past year was approved. There were no questions. And now I'm going to I don't think there's any questions from the group, but if there are, let me know. And I'm going to hand this over to Alessandro. Alessandro, okay.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, give me 1 second there, Dr. Evans. Let me just share. Dr. Evans, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. So this past November State Board meeting, we presented our third and final presentation on the North Carolina Teacher Working Conditions Survey. I've been asked to do a quick follow-up with you all on that presentation. Just going to go over and skim over the slides that we presented. As you all know, the Teacher Working Conditions Survey happens every 2 years. It is funded by the General Assembly, completely different budget code, completely different funding source than DPI. And the third and final report is a little bit of a deeper dive into the survey and exactly what is it that we give out to superintendents across North Carolina in terms of data. The survey is divided into the 12 constructs, into the 10 constructs that you see down there below. We're going to go over these a little bit in all the reports: school and teacher leadership, instructional practices, managing student conduct, professional learning, community support, time, facilities and resources, safety, equity, and new teacher supports. As we know, the purpose of the survey is for us at the State Department, for districts and for schools and our legislators to be able to use the data in different types of strategic planning, policy-making decisions, and conversations about our schools and our districts and how we can support them better. This year, we had a new vendor that helped us with the survey. ADI, Academic Development Institute, was our partner. So with a new vendor came a new website. That website went live in January. That website will be live for the next 2 years as we are able to look at the data and see how our schools and districts responded to the many questions. And you just need to visit www.nctwcs.org to get all that information. As everyone in this committee knows, the survey happens in the month of March. We had a tremendous social media campaign this year, thanks to our DPI communications department. We definitely, that was probably the largest social media campaign we've ever done. And I think that helped us tremendously in getting the record-breaking results that we got this year. So for the first time ever, we had over 112,000 respondents to the survey out of 122 that got invited. You can see that's a record of 91.96% response rate, which is amazing for a survey and a survey of this magnitude, of this size. A breakdown of what that looks like in terms of our schools across North Carolina. Out of 2,743 buildings in our state, 2,690 received data. And you needed to reach a minimum threshold of 40% of your staff to respond to the survey in order to receive that data. So that left only 53 schools statewide that did not receive data this time around. The 112,000 is broken down into 87% of those were teachers, 9% were other certified staff, whether it be counselors, psychologists, social workers, others in the buildings that took the survey. Principals commanded 2% of that total of 112,000, and assistant principals were another 2% of that total of 112,000. The website has many resources available to you, including different types of reports. You can look at each of the schools in the entire state of North Carolina, and at the same time, look at all the questions and how each school responded and compared their response rates to the state and the district. We also added a new feature on the left-hand side of the website while you're looking at these reports that allows you to jump to the different constructs and the different areas of the survey. So that way you can more quickly find what you're looking for. If you're looking, for example, in this case, the questions that had to do with time, and do I as a teacher feel I have enough time to do what I need to do? There's also reports that allow you to not only see comparisons to the state and district, but you can also will be able to see how your school has done in the past 3 editions of the survey. So you could see 2018 response rates, you can see 2020, and you can see 2022. All the survey reports that are on the website can be exported to PDF and Excel, especially if you need to manipulate or use it for your own research. Some of the new features that we added this year to the website are some new resources and tools. We've been working hard on okay, we have the survey data, now what? That always has been a question, so we've tried to help schools and district leaders with that question. We've added a data protocol that can be downloaded and can be used as school improvement teams or district improvement teams are breaking down the data. And we also, because of the fact that the vendor that we are using is the same vendor that helps us with NC STAR, which is the school improvement planning tool that's used in North Carolina, we've added a crosswalk into NC STAR so that when school improvement teams are meeting, they can also break down the effective practices in NC STAR by the questions of the survey. So if they have certain questions of the survey that they want to improve, the system will automatically allow them to see what indicators they might want to focus on. What are those effective practices that the team might want to focus on in their school? During the summer and fall, many different reports go out to superintendents. Basically, our regional education facilitators at DPI send out an email with a link to a Google folder. That Google folder, in July, we added the scatter plots, and I'll show you in a couple of seconds what those look like, that break down the data from that district into each of the constructs. And then 2 weeks ago, we sent out the rest of these reports. You have the beginning new teacher summary data, beginning versus veteran teacher data, stayers, movers, leavers data report, and then since 2018, we've been using Dr. Ingersoll's research, and we've been adding that data as well for superintendents to look at. So the scatter plots are basically a breakdown of all the schools in the district on an X and Y axis as seen here. They get an overall scatter plot, and then they also get a breakdown of each of the constructs, of each of the different groups of questions that are on the survey. So as a superintendent, if I'm looking at these scatter plots, then basically if I was to read this, for example, when it comes to managing student conduct, school FRM, right now we are using abbreviations, but in the real, so no one can see who they are. But in the real superintendent report, they would see the entire school name. But in this case, if I'm looking at managing student conduct, FRM would maybe be a school I would need to have a conversation with and talk about how we can provide resources and support to improve managing student conduct in this case. But then you have other situations, for example, when it comes to the teacher leadership questions. We see that HCC and HCE buildings in this district did very well in the questions associated with teacher leadership. So maybe we can have a conversation with them. What are the things that they are doing that other schools can possibly copy and can possibly emulate? So this is the different scatter plots that superintendents received. And like I said earlier, they received one for each of the constructs. So they also have one for retention, they have one for safety, and they also received one for equity. Through the years, we've provided more and more data as for schools and district leaders to make decisions. One of those is the heat maps that tie to Dr. Ingersoll's research on school improvement. And what Dr. Ingersoll did back in 2016-17 is he studied working condition surveys across the United States. Now, we were the first state to do a survey of this size statewide. We have 18 states now in the country. Most of them copy the questions that North Carolina uses. And what Dr. Ingersoll found in his studying of all these surveys was that there are 5 questions in particular in the survey that can tell us a lot about if the school is moving in the right direction. Most of these questions have to do with whether we have teacher voice in place and we are having teachers have a say in what goes on in the building. And then obviously accountability and whether we are holding teachers to high professional standards in our school. Districts received reports that basically not only show them every school in their district, how they responded to the 5 questions, but also gave them a comparison to their region and to their state. And obviously, when you look at the heat maps, anything that's in red or in orange, those are definitely areas possibly that conversations could take place with that school and how we can help improve that in the building. For the past 3 editions of the survey, the state board has requested different comparisons, and we've provided that in the state board presentation. In this case, we're comparing all the constructs between the schools that were designated low performing from the September list to the schools that were not designated low performing. So this is a look at all schools across North Carolina. As we know, this year we have 864 schools that were designated low performing, and then the other comparison would be about 1,800 schools statewide. What you notice in this and in the next slide is that all schools are asking for professional learning opportunities, and that's definitely a good talking point, not only for us, but for our General Assembly and for definitely district leaders as how we can possibly provide. And as was mentioned at the state board when this got presented, not only is there a request for professional development from all our educators, but also for differentiation in professional development, to have choice in PD. We also notice gaps when it comes to community support and involvement between our low performing and non-low performing. There's a 10% gap there. And we also notice the questions that have to do with time, there's a 7% gap there. Same thing happens when we go a little deeper and we analyze the schools that are recurring low performing. And those are schools that have been low performing 2 of the past 3 years. We still see a common response about PD, around 48-50%, but we also notice the same gaps. There's a 12% gap when it comes to community support and involvement, 8% gap when it comes to time. In the 2020, the state board asked us to do a comparison between our traditional and charter schools. You can notice all the constructs here. Very similar results to what we just discussed about professional learning. But then you also notice 2 interesting differences when it comes to time. Once again, you see traditional schools responding a little lower than our charter schools, but then the flip occurs when it comes to the retention questions. Charter schools responding a little lower than our traditional schools. In addition, the superintendents get a report that analyzes the survey based on how respondents answered the question on whether they are a stayer, mover, or leaver. A stayer means that the educator was planning to remain at the school when they responded to the survey. A mover means the educator was planning on moving to another building or moving to a higher position, whether it's school administration or district office. And a leaver was one that told the survey that they were planning on leaving education altogether. So we break down the data according to those 3 levels, and we provide a report to all superintendents. We also are able to break down the data based on our beginning teachers. And what we see across North Carolina is that every region is almost the same when it comes to the answers that beginning teachers give. We do have some great news is that 95%, a really high number, agreed that they were all assigned mentors. Now, the other pieces of this, it's definitely things that we need to look at as a district leader or as a school leader, is all the other requests that our beginning teachers are making. For example, 53% of our beginning teachers talk about having formal time to meet with mentors during school hours, which means the other half say they do not have that. And then additional supports needed in developing lesson plans, being observed by my teacher mentor, all these other things that the survey allows us to see and the data allows us to start dissecting. When it comes to comparisons from the past 3 survey editions, we see that most of the questions have stayed the same. There has not been many changes when it comes to BT support across North Carolina. And then the last report that superintendents get is a teacher versus veteran teacher report. Basically, again, dissecting the questions of the survey based on how the survey responded to that question of how many years they have been in education. Veteran teachers, for this case, were those educators with 4 or more years of experience. In June, when we presented the preliminary data to the state board asked us if we could compare the questions on the survey that our administrators were asked that are very similar to the ones that our educators, our teachers were asked. So we provided that this time in this presentation. There are about 15 or 16 questions that both administrators and educators are responding to. So we're going to break them down by construct. When it comes to community support and involvement, our principals and our educators in our schools basically responded almost the same there. Not a lot of disagreement when it came to community support of the schools. When it came to managing student conduct questions, both principals and teachers agreed on the safe environment. 92% strongly agreed there, 88% for our teachers. There was a 10% difference when it came to managing discipline in the building, with teachers a little lower in the terms of in rate of agreement. When it came to decision making, both groups were pretty identical in their response. When it came to leadership, atmosphere of trust and respect in the building or in the district, pretty similar as well. Professional development, there was a slight drop here when it came to principals responding to the questions on PD, principals basically asking for more professional development. And this matches what we know across the country when it comes to professional development, what we see, especially in federal money. We see that 91% of federal funds are used for PDs for teachers, PD to build instruction in the classroom. And very little is done at the principal level, and there's a lot of work that we are trying to do in North Carolina and at DPI to provide professional development for our school administrators. Now, when it came to the safety questions, we definitely noticed a difference between how principals responded to these questions and teachers. You do notice some gaps of 20 or 30% in some cases. And we attribute this to the fact that the principal is more aware of what's happening in the entire building, while the teacher is more aware of what's happening with his or her 120, 140 students. So when it comes to questions about bullying, definitely the principal felt that that occurred more frequently than the teacher. When it came to vandalism or conflicts among students, the principals that responded to the survey felt that they occurred more often than teachers responded. And that just has to do with the job. Principals are definitely more aware of what's going on in the entire building. Good news is that when it came to safety and security procedures, whether it be an active shooter, lockdown, fire drills, national earth tornado warnings, all those things, everyone responded with high marks. Everyone seems to be aware of what to do in those cases. So that was the quick rundown of the presentation we gave to the state board last 2 weeks ago. Any questions?
This is Connie. I have a question.
Sure.
Was there any conversation as it relates to teacher retention?
At the state board presentation, there was not, no. We do know from the previous presentation that we gave at the state board in June that this year we had 7% of the respondents say that they were leaving the profession. However, there's no breakdown of that if they're leaving because of retirement or simply leaving. But that was a conversation at the June presentation, but not at this November presentation.
Is there a question? And I don't remember, it's been a while since I did the survey in March, but is there a question there that specifies why they were leaving? Or is that something that was discussed, maybe adding in there?
That's definitely something we can look at with the advisory council. We have thought about adding the additional, are you retiring to the survey? That would allow us to break down the data better.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Thank you all.
I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Dempsey.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Thank you, Mr. Montanari and Dr. Evans for the presentation, information, and discussion. In the next agenda item, excuse me, I'm working through a cold. I want to give a little bit of framing for the components in the agenda that are coming next. I shared this information out in a message to the commission members yesterday, but to give people a context for the next parts of the presentations and discussions. Since the October Pepsi meeting, I've had the opportunity to be in several discussions with Ms. Allison Schaefer, the State Board of Education attorney, whom you will hear from in just a minute, Mr. Eric Davis, the chair of the state board, primarily focused on, number one, the way the statute that outlines Pepsi's responsibilities and work that we do connects to the work that we're doing in the Pathways Initiative, and that's what Ms. Schaefer is going to talk about in a second. And then also the way the work that we're doing right now and will continue to do in Pepsi connects to the communication and the work that will begin soon relative to the relationship between Pepsi and the State Board of Education. So first, we're going to hear from Ms. Schaefer about the statute itself. I found her information and overview extremely helpful, and I thought the Pepsi members would appreciate that as well. The second, since the last meeting, Chair Davis asked if I would give a summary of the work that Pepsi had done thus far so that the State Board of Education members had an understanding of where we have been in Pepsi and where this work sits now. So I also will share information about that summary after Ms. Schaefer shares her presentation. Out of that summary, one of the components is what has been referred to in that meeting with the State Board in a sense as a blueprint action statements. And I want to say just a little bit about that relative to the remainder of the meeting today. Two critical points, one that we'll understand better, I think, after Ms. Schaefer's presentation. The document as it currently exists, the Pathways Initiative document, is a working document of Pepsi. That document remains with Pepsi, and we continue to work on that document. Any subsequent related or emerging policy review, policy development, and changes that would be needed in statute relative to the responsibilities of Pepsi would come back to Pepsi. So as we continue to do this work, the work relative to the language in the statute always comes back to Pepsi. So part of the discussion today is that we are at a transition point in the work where in order to move the work forward in Pepsi, we need to communicate to the State Board of Education to begin identifying the potential policy-related and statute-related changes that would be connected to how the Pathways Initiative develops and the more developmental and detailed work that we'll do down the road. So in today's meeting, we'll hear from Ms. Schaefer. I'll share a summary that'll be quick of what I shared with the State Board of Education. We'll review the revisions and questions as we have done in September and October in the current draft of the Pathways document. And then I'm going to ask the Commission to consider 3 actions to undertake by the Commission relative to our relationship with the State Board. One is to consider and forward to the State Board the action summary, the blueprint action summary statements. The second is to request, based on that action summary from the State Board, determining the statutes and policies that would be impacted by Pepsi's work with the Pathways Initiative. And then the third, direction from the State Board on the development of potential implementation and recommendations for that would come out of Pepsi to the board. So that is the transition point that we're in right now. We will continue to do the work that we have been doing, and we'll continue to steward the document. We will also begin the process, hopefully, of starting that communication to the State Board of Education in terms of next steps. So, Ms. Schaefer, I will turn it over to you, and then I'll do my summary. We can pause for questions, and then we'll go to the revisions review. So, Ms. Schaefer.
Thank you. I am going to apologize ahead of time for my voice and my potential coughing because I am homesick, but I am home sick. But I am aware that this is the timing of this is important, and we needed to move forward with this presentation. And I'm happy to be before you. So if I cut off for a minute because I start coughing, forgive me. I will do my best, and I will be pretty brief. This is a presentation that was made to the State Board last week at its meeting. The idea was to clarify, at the request of the chairman, the role of Pepsi and the interplay between Pepsi and the State Board in preparation for discussing what needed to be done to move any consideration of the Pathways concept into statute. So that's where the discussion was. So Dr. Evans is going to advance the slides for me, so I'm going to depend on her to do that. So the first thing we're going to cover is just a recap of Pepsi's governing laws. And again, this was what I made to a presentation.
Sorry, Ms. Schaefer, we just can't hear very well.
Okay, let me see what I can do. Is that better?
That is a little better. Thank you.
I apologize. So my goal here was with this presentation was to present to the State Board a framework for how Pepsi and the State Board under the law, and then what the State Board's role would be in this matter going forward. So that's where we are. Are you okay with that? I'm just having trouble speaking with my voice. Okay, so Pepsi was created by the General Assembly in 2017. Next slide. And the statutory purpose was to involve holders in establishing high standards for North Carolina educators. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. The role of the commission and the general statement of the statute says was to make rule recommendations regarding all aspects of preparation, licensures, and continuing education standards of conduct for public school educators. So similar to the way we have the Charter School Advisory for things issues come before Pepsi with regard to teacher licensure and teacher preparation programs before the State Board and our schools, and the Pepsi makes recommendations to the State Board. The commission is this is again the statute, is located administratively under the State Board, but exercises its powers and duties independently of the State Board. So the statute specifically sets out who's on Pepsi. There are 2 standing members of Pepsi, the state superintendent and the state teacher of the year, and then the other 16 members are appointed by the General Assembly and serve designated terms. Half by the House, half by the Senate. Generally, they are professional educators or people or deans of colleges of education educator preparation programs, and other superintendent, school administrators, personnel, and all that, personnel administrators. Okay. So there are specific duties, powers, and duties spelled out in North Carolina General Statute. There are 2 statutes that apply to Pepsi. First one is setting it up. The second is to spelling out its powers and duties. Next slide, please. There are 3 major duties. The duties of Pepsi are to develop and recommend to the state board rules related to all aspects of the educator preparation program. So again, policies and rule changes come through Pepsi first and recommended to the state board with regard to EPs. Next slide. The other main area of responsibility for Pepsi is to develop and recommend to the state board rules recommended to all aspects of professional standards for EPPs, for North Carolina educators. So this is the licensure issue. And then the final area of responsibility of Pepsi is to provide recommendations as requested to the State Board of Education related to the EPP programs and the professional standards or licensure issues. Okay. The revisions of the licensure issues would fall under this 3rd category because we are, I think what you'll see by the end of this presentation, we are not ready to, we're not at the making process yet. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The final requirement is for the commission to recommend ways to ensure that clinical practice requirements effectively prepare high quality professional educators. So those are the statutory roles of Pepsi. The process that Pepsi is required to follow is to submit its recommendations to the state board as i.e. rules recommendations and other recommendations as requested by the state board. Again, the process we're looking at now with regard to revision of licensure at this point is a special request from the chairman. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Next. Okay. The statute also says with regard to process that the state board shall adopt or reject the rules recommendation. And the state board may not make it substantive changes to rules recommendations that it adopts in the first instance. Next. If the state board does reject the rules recommendation, it has to send it back to Pepsi with specific reasons why it was rejected. And then Pepsi can amend the rules recommendation and resubmit it to the state board. And then the state board has to adopt or recommend, again, the rules recommendation. If the state board fails to adopt Pepsi's original or amended rule recommendation, the state board may develop and adopt its own rules. So basically, this is 2 bites at the apple for Pepsi on rules recommendations. It comes to the state board says yes or no. It goes back to Pepsi for revisions and then comes back to the state board. And if the state board rejects that, then it can adopt its own rules. Okay, so just very briefly, the standard for adoptions of rules are as follows. The state board is limited by general statute as to what it may adopt as rules. And it specifically says that the agency cannot adopt rules if they do one of the following. And the main one that is applicable here is number 1, which is implementing or interpreting a law unless that law or another specific law authorizes the agency to do so. So again, we need to have statutory authorization for the rules that the state board adopts that are recommended to the state board. So that is the main issue here is we need to have authorizing laws in order to adopt rules. Next slide, please. So the request and the issue that's currently before Pepsi, next slide, please, is a request made at the February 4, 2021 meeting after there was a presentation to the state board regarding a proposal to revise the requirements for training, retention, and licensure of teachers. And I'll be right back. Okay, forgive me, I'm going to be sucking on a cup, but I'm going to plow through here. I'm getting close to being done. Next slide, please. After the end of the February 4, 2021 meeting, the State Board Chairman requested that Pepsi study and make recommendations to the State Board on how best to implement the recommended model. That's a broad request. Next slide. Okay, next slide, please. So the current status is this. The teacher licensure statutes are found in the general statutes in Chapter 115C, and they include very specific requirements for teacher licensure. For example, the statutes provide for very specific types of teacher licensure, including things like a residency license, a continuing license. Those are all spelled out in statute. It also requires teachers to achieve minimum scores on professional preparation exams. Next slide. That's my PowerPoint there. Okay. So what we have here is that the current educator statutes, educator licensure statutes, are very specific, and many of them specifically define the programs that are found in statute, and that Pepsi has been working on. Next, please. Since the State Board can only adopt rules governing licensure in accordance with Article 17 of Chapter 115C, i.e. the licensure chapter or article, the general statutes must be amended to allow something different than what is currently in them. And the State Board is not lawfully authorized to adopt a new licensure plan without statutory changes. So the next step, again, I apologize for the coughing, is for Pepsi to develop in developing a new licensure system would be for Pepsi to recommend the State Board to approve a request for statutory changes that will allow it to develop such a system or plan. In other words, we need to change the statute. The statute needs to be changed before the State Board is authorized to adopt a new system. What it can do, and so one of the issues before you now is to think about what requested changes need to be made. And I think that's what Dr. Dempsey was discussing. But also implementation issues, such as one of the things that has been discussed is the pilot program as an example. So you all need to think about how you want to do that. I'm going to stop this presentation and mute myself, but if anybody has any questions, I hope you will answer them. And I apologize again for my illness, but I wanted to do what I was asked to do, which was bring you this information.
Hey, Ms. Schaefer, can you repeat that last part that you said where we need to be thinking about? You cut out for just a minute, and I didn't clearly understand that.
Sure. The Pepsi at this point needs to be thinking about what recommendation it would make to the State Board with regard to statutory changes that would be necessary to implement a new licensure program, including things like authorization for a pilot program, which is something that has been discussed in some conversations around this issue. So that's kind of what's before you today, is what recommendations you're going to make to the State Board about what recommended changes to the statutory system need to be made in order to move forward with this plan. But right now, the State Board doesn't have the authority to implement a plan to adopt, that is not permitted by statute.
Other questions or comments?
Chairman Dempsey, this is Scott. I could not understand much of Mrs. Schaefer's presentation, I think because of her microphone. But I think that if you are going to clarify this later on, please tell me and I will defer. But I think I need clarification eventually on what it is we are actually requesting in the adoption of those three items that you outlined earlier. Are we requesting, or will we be voting on approval of the framework and model, or will we be voting on this question of a request to the legislature for the change of rules? I think that's a question that I bring out of Ms. Schaefer's presentation.
Yes, we are, and this will, I think, will become more clear when I go through the presentation that I provide to the state board. We are requesting, based on the structural recommendations that you'll see in just a second, that the state board begin to take action under their responsibilities and authority to seek those actions relative to the General Assembly that are going to be necessary for us to, number one, continue the work. We can continue the work, but we can't take any work we've done and move it toward any kind of policy or statutory changes until the State Board of Education has a sense of direction from us about what Pepsi, what we need to be doing within Pepsi. So you'll see that in those thematic statements, those structural statements. And then the second piece of it is for the state board to seek that authorization that Ms. Schaefer just described. And so the motion is not going to be on the document. The document itself continues to be a working document in Pepsi, the pathways document. Right now, we're asking the State Board of Education to take the actions that they need as we begin to move toward further refinement and potential recommendations for implementation.
Thank you. That is very helpful.
I'll go ahead, Dr. Evans, if we could just go ahead and walk through the presentation that I did with the board, and I'll do this pretty quickly. And happy to answer questions if people have them. Just while Dr. Evans is pulling this up, so my presentation to the State Board of Education to explain and put a articulation to the work that we had done over 20 months followed Ms. Schaefer's presentation to help with the understanding of the work that Pepsi is doing is situated in that third subsection of the statute that Ms. Schaefer just explained, that the request and charge came to Pepsi for the development of the pathways framework, which is different from the work that Pepsi typically does, which is the consideration of an existing policy or something that's in existing statute. So, Dr. Evans, if we could just go ahead and move through. I did the best that I could given time frame and trying to represent the work of 20 months and 100 people and the conversations that we've had in Pepsi in September and October to speak to that request about the structure of the work that we have done. I shared a general overview of what those comments would be. So Dr. Evans, if you go ahead and move through, I reinforced the powers and duties of Pepsi relative to the statute that Ms. Schaefer just talked about, shared perspective on why North Carolina needs to do this work relative to stressors and challenges that we were having within the teaching profession in North Carolina. So you see those stresses and fractures language that is there. So why is North Carolina engaged in this work from the perspective of my role as a Pepsi member and Pepsi chair? And then Dr. Evans, if you just move ahead. So what you're seeing in this section is that my speaking to those stresses and fractures and lack of coherency in the current system that we have in North Carolina, and how there are tensions that are pulling at the structures the structure for the profession that we currently have. So Dr. Evans, I shared a couple of comments. These were comments that are mine from my perspective as an educator, as a dean, as a member of Pepsi, about why I individually think that this work is important, and that's what you see captured on that slide. You go to the next slide. And then I talked about the tensions and juxtapositions that, as I have read and listened to the recordings and looked at the work of the 4 subcommittees, and then the conversations that we have had so far in Pepsi relative to the Pathways document, that we know that there are these tensions within the profession right now in North Carolina, where we've got to reconcile some of these issues that are starting to emerge in order to build the profession that we need, and build what sounds like is emerging from the work that has come out of the 4 subcommittees and is now before Pepsi. And we would see embedded in the document itself and the kinds of revisions that we're talking about. So that this section is about those tensions and juxtapositions, that we have forces that are pulling against each other in terms of how people are coming into the profession now in the early licensure components that we talked about in the model, and then what the nature of the knowledge base looks like and how people come to know it, so they have the capacity to practice as successful educators. Dr. Evans, if you go to the next one. And so this section speaks to those, tries to speak to those issues. It also speaks to questions and concerns that have been raised in the feedback that we've received, and we're trying to represent that and be honest to those concerns in the tensions component of this language. If you go to the next, please. And then I talked a little bit about design elements of the profession itself. So if we think about the conversations that we've had in the subcommittees, conversations that we've had in Pepsi, the background research and literature on teaching as a profession, work that has been done in North Carolina in multiple spaces that are helping to inform the work that we're doing, that comes from organizations and professional stakeholder groups that have been information that's been provided to Pepsi. What are those basic design elements that are part of this work and that we've been talking about in Pepsi as those structural design components that sit underneath the teaching profession in the state? If you move to the next one, and you'll see more of those. You have, by the way, you have this document in your materials for the meeting. We'll do this. Move to the next one. So to close the presentation to the state board, and in my effort to summarize the structural elements that are coming out of the work that we are doing, and the blueprint for action is my language, but the blueprint, the architecture of blueprint metaphor helps me to think through this. These 10 recommendations, these 10 blueprint for action statements, were the summary, my synthesis of this work that I offered to the State Board of Education. And these are in a standalone document that you have in the meeting materials. But Ms. Evans, if you would just roll to the next slide, and we're going to look at these again a little bit later in the meeting. So when I completed the presentation, the state board members then had discussions about these elements. Number one, relative to their understanding of what the Pepsi work it has included so far, and then secondly, how does the structure of this help position us to move forward relative to the actions that would be taken by the State Board of Education? Number one, under their responsibility as a state board, and number two, to then interact with Pepsi in terms of how we continue to develop the pathways, the elements of the pathways, and start to make recommendations to State Board of Education under our authority as Pepsi. So if you go ahead and go to the next one. And so I think the numbering is wrong there. I didn't catch that. There are the 10 statements. These are structural statements. It is not meant to represent the detail, the levels of detail that have been part of our discussions in the subcommittees and in Pepsi in September and October. It's an effort to capture those structural components of what we're doing. And this language becomes the basis of giving the State Board of Education the framing they need to begin to take the action that they need to take so we can continue to advance this work. So that was my presentation that followed Ms. Schaefer's presentation. And in the message that I sent out to Pepsi yesterday, I believe as chair and based on conversations where I've been a part, we're at a point where we need to address this transition point while we continue to do the work with the Pathways document, and also understanding clearly the responsibilities that are part of Pepsi's charge relative to policy and statute that impact educator preparation and educator standards. So we'll pause there for a second to see if you have questions. We'll have time later in the agenda to discuss the blueprint statements more thoroughly. But I wanted to give people a summary of Ms. Schaefer's and my presentation last week to the board. So any questions or comments you have? So to be respectful to the process that we have initiated, Dr. Evans and I have continued to try to capture and integrate into the work the questions and the recommendations that have come out of in this case, that came out of the October meeting as we continue to develop and refine this document and its components. That work will continue while we are considering these actions relative to the State Board of Education that I'll ask for later in the meeting. But Dr. Evans, if you would, the structure of the document has not changed. There is language relative to potential edits and revisions that may be new. So Dr. Evans, if you would walk us through that.
Chair Dempsey, this is Randy. I have a quick question.
Yes.
I might have missed it. Will we, as a commission, have opportunity to have dialogue on and ask questions about the points that the blueprint points that you just presented? And I apologize if I missed that you just covered when we'll be doing this.
Yes, I'm going to try to make sure that we have adequate time in the latter part of the meeting after we've reviewed the revisions that people have raised. And so we will get to that. And yes, we'll be able to review those 10 statements. I will say, based on the conversations that I've had so far and then the discussions with Ms. Schaefer about the process, I think this understanding of the statute responsibilities that are Pepsi's responsibilities actually gives us more time and more room to work toward the development of the framework itself and the components of the framework as we keep moving forward. So I think that is beneficial to the work that we're doing and the understanding that the Pathways document itself is a document that Pepsi is stewarding, and the work comes back. Any of those subsequent potential changes come back to Pepsi. So yes, Dr. Enfield, we are going to discuss them later in the meeting.
Right. Thanks.
So Dr. Evans, if you would review the action items that we captured from the last meeting.
Sure. So I just want to start with saying that the two action items that were not addressed yet are looking at the teaching assistant versus the apprentice piece. I still need to speak with Superintendent Truitt, and so that detail there will be addressed a little later. And then also the fiscal impact, what needs are there and what should be included in the recommendation, that has not been addressed yet. But the rest of the action items you will see throughout the document. Dr. Dempsey, did you want to go through slide by slide to show those changes?
I think if we can do that and pause and let people ask questions as they have them.
Sure.
And please jump in if you have questions.
Right. Or you can add them in the chat.
Yes.
If you would like. So we added the new teacher support program here to be included with the ITSP. We updated language on this slide for the license term. More with ITSP, including new teacher support program. And then we also updated that the support is for the teacher as defined in the MOU between the PSU and an EPP. Making language more specific for the term of the license, and then talking about the different license levels, the different licenses for the in-task standards. And then more specifics around the micro-credential piece for license 2. And just more refined language overall. Oh, I will enlarge the document. Is that better for everyone? Sorry about that. No changes to this slide or the example slide for the micro-credential piece. You can see that there's the clarifying language with micro-credentials. And you'll see that throughout the document. Then the categories and components, the 10 NTASC standards that it's spread across content and pedagogy. We mentioned that last time to reach both components. And then more clarifying language with support and new teacher support program for ITSP. And then this is the last slide for license 2. More clarifying language for in-text standards for licenses 1 through 3. And you'll see more clarifying language throughout this slide. You'll see some of the same changes throughout all of these licenses. And getting into license 4. And then with license 4, also including the step increase for license 1 and 2 and 3. And that's been adjusted for this chart.
Dr. Evans, a question in the chat, the clarification of the meaning of or tools designed to measure impact on student learning. It's in the categories table.
Oh, let's go back to that. So the licensure subcommittee, they had talked about instead of saying peer, that they would have it open where it would be tools that were designed to measure student learning and growth. And so then they weren't limited to only peer. They didn't want to name it that particular acronym. So then they were left open to include whatever tools were developed.
Hey, Van, that was just this is Ann. That wasn't kind of like, we didn't want to close the door if other things were developed later that we would want to include to think about that.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Bull.
My question was about the row below that, EVOS, or tools designed to measure impact on student learning.
That was actually what I was answering, sorry. So that is the open door comment actually as well. Both of those leave the door open.
Any other questions?
Kim, this is Connie.
Hey, Connie.
I want to go, I'm going back reading over and over. Maybe I'm missing it, so I apologize in advance. The comment that I shared last time about ensuring that there were enough teachers to support the beginning teachers, is that included in, I'm looking back over.
So
go ahead.
That's also one of the areas that I know Dr. Penfield was also focusing on. So Dr. Tomerlin has some data to go with that question. If you're interested in exploring that.
Yes, I am, because I'm concerned about districts that may not have the capacity to support the beginning teachers.
Okay, let me share that.
Dr. Evans, we likely will address that also when we walk through those 10 statements, because that concern and strategic need is captured in those statements.
Okay. Great.
So, Chair Dempsey, this is Tom Chamberlain. Did you want us to present this data at this time, or do you want us to wait?
If you could do a quick overview, I think it will become one of the components that we look at when we as we continue to define the model, because the part of the response to the question, are we going to have, is knowing what we need. And that is more work to be done, but it's an important question. So if you want to give an overview of what this data tells us, that might be helpful.
Sure. So, Dr. Locklear, I want to specifically address your question. This analysis does not cover the question you're asking, which is the distribution of effective teachers and highly effective teachers in districts. We've done some preliminary work on that. I don't have anything prepared for you today, but it does look like when we use the State Board of Education defined metric of what constitutes a highly effective teacher, which of course in that case uses both evaluation and EVOS, we do find that districts that are considered low performing do have about 4 to 5 percentage points fewer highly effective teachers in their schools than schools that are non-low performing. And those numbers run about 15% for non-low performing to 11% in low performing districts. So your point is well taken that the implementation of this model has to appreciate the fact that some districts may not see an adequate number of highly effective teachers in their district to support those advanced teaching roles. But that would also, the same question would exist under our current situation. Like what are those schools, how are those schools able to support their beginning teachers currently, irrespective of whichever model we choose? But this in particular is a question that was raised by a PEPC member about the identification of teachers as being highly effective or in need of improvement if we were to use the two standard tools that we have now. And the first one is evaluation, principal evaluation of teachers, and how does that distribution of effectiveness look across the state. And if you see in this first chart, and I hope everybody can see this okay, if we use 5 years of NESIS data, for these are teachers, you'll notice the N here is 55,000. This is teachers who have at least 5 years of NESIS data over the prior 6 years. And if you look at if we defined highly effective as those teachers whose minimum rating on NESIS was accomplished and all the other standards were at least higher than that, across the state, we would see 66% of our teaching staff would qualify as highly effective, with another 34% being categorized as effective. And effective would mean that their minimum rating on any one of the standards was proficient, and with other standards being higher than that. And then finally, we look at teachers who would have some kind of rating below proficient, any rating below proficient over that, calculating that best 3 out of 5, we would have 43 teachers, which doesn't even register as a percentage of being needs improvement. The other question that we got was, well, what if we said we're just going to look at 2 out of 3 years rather than the 3 out of 5 years? And Kim, if you will click on chart 2 there at the bottom. There we go. So this does that same analysis with teachers. Nope, we're not there yet. There we go. This does that same analysis for teachers. We're looking at 2 years, the best 2 years they have. So if they had 2 years effective and 2 years highly effective, we consider them highly effective. And so that would result in 78% of our teaching force being identified as highly effective, 22% being effective, and 10 total teachers in the state would be in need of improvement. So then the other question was, let's look at growth using that same kind of analysis. And from chart 1, we hear, let's get. In chart 1, so here we look at EVOS over a 5-year period. And we're using their best 3 ratings out of 5 years. And you can see the N is much smaller here because, one, growth doesn't cover all teachers in the state. And secondly, we're really restricting this to folks who have 5 years of EVOS data. So that makes that percentage go down, and that number go down even further. If we use this as the measure, then 78% of our teachers across the state would be considered effective, with 15% being designated as highly effective and about 7% of the teaching force being identified as in need of improvement or not meeting expectations of growth. Then we did the second chart to do what if we did this 2 out of 3 years, and you can see here that if we do the 2 out of 3 years, then 71% of the teaching force is effective, with 26% being categorized as highly effective, and now you have about 3% as need of improvement or not meeting expectations of growth. So I hope this this analysis answers the question that was put before us, but I will leave it to commission members to ask any questions they might have.
Thank you, Dr. Stoneman.
This is Bill here. Based on the standards that we currently have for the proposals of an effective teacher and that salary standard 4, what percent of our teachers would not meet those standards at this current time? Do we have any data on that?
So I don't know that we've developed standards for what constitutes a license 4. I mean, I think you'd have to kind of look at this data and say, if you think an effective teacher is a license 4 teacher, if you were to use evaluation ratings and then an advanced teacher or a license 4 plus to qualify for that, they were highly effective under the evaluation system, then what you would see is, Kim, let's go back to eval. I'm sorry, the eval analysis, and let's use 2 out of 3 there. So you would see, no, I'm sorry, go back to 3 out of 5, I'm sorry, chart 1. If you use 3 out of 5, then virtually 100% of your teaching force would be characterized as license 4, with 2/3 of that population being eligible to hold one of those advanced roles. And then the contrast to that would be with the growth analysis. If that were the defining thing, and I'm not in any way suggesting that just one or the other should be, I'm just kind of pointing out the differences in the distributions. If you used EVOS to make that determination, then 70% of your teaching force would be considered a license 4, with about 22% being identified as eligible for those advanced roles, and about 6% being the target group that we want these teachers to help support and become better. Does that answer your question, Dr. Griffin?
Yeah, so as we're saying, if it's an either or on those standards or qualifications, then ultimately 6% of our teachers currently speaking would not be eligible for a license. Is that accurate?
That's not the way I think what the model is suggesting is those teachers would probably qualify for a license 1, 2, or 3. I think the intention of the whole model is that resources are dedicated and expert teachers are dedicated to helping those teachers become licensed for teachers. And I would venture to say that those teachers that are in that rating category are probably early career teachers, the ones that we're talking about the model providing support for. And I'm not sure that I've heard that this is an either or proposition, that you choose either evaluation or EVAS. I think the conversations that I've heard have been, you need multiple ways for teachers to demonstrate this. It's clear from this analysis that EVAS cannot be the primary driver of whether a teacher is deemed effective, because it covers this measure. The way we've constructed this with multiple years, this would only cover a quarter of your teaching population.
This is Ann. So my question would be, if this is our data, I mean, this just asks a whole bigger picture about EBOS to me, and what that means for our state and what we're doing to our teachers and what this, just the whole piece of it. And who is looking at that?
Dr. Bullock, if I might
yes,
make a suggestion, that kind of question and the previous question are the work for what comes after today. Now we've been doing that in the Pepsi meetings thus far, in the subcommittees. When we look at those action statements, part of what I think we will be able to do as we move forward is take groups that have focused on broad sets of issues and get a more focused development of what the recommendation would be around what is the evidence that we use to make these determinations, and then what's the impact of that evidence depending on how that falls out. So all these questions are the ones that we would continue to develop the more finely stated recommendations, if that makes sense.
Crystal clear. Thanks, ma'am.
Oh, thank you.
Chair Dempsey, this is Randy. Can I follow up with a question for Dr. Tomberlin?
Sure.
Hey, Dr. Tomberlin, thanks for this presentation. That's really informative. I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. You presented the data for percentages related to the rating evaluation, and then for EVAS. But what we haven't seen, it would be the scenario in the current model where it's that either or. I just want to make sure that you haven't presented that yet, have you?
Can you tell me what you mean by either or?
Sorry. Well, where you could reach that level in the pathways model for that level for classroom excellence or adult leadership through either reaching the standards through the rating evaluation process, or, for example, having 3 out of 5 years exceeding growth in EVAS. You can reach that standard through either of those methods. And what you've presented is each of those individually, but not the percentage of individuals who could have met it using through one or both of those. Am I understanding that right?
I see what you're saying. Yes. So you're right. I don't have that. I don't have the kind of intersection of how many teachers are we talking would be highly effective if you considered either the EVAS or the rating, the evaluation ratings. It would, but I would say that it would be somewhere north of the 66% you're seeing in the evaluation data. There's, I mean, I think what's coming out of this is overwhelmingly the evaluation data tells us that all teachers are highly effective. And and EVOS is probably intersecting because it's so large. EVOS, the highly effective designation in EVOS, is probably largely coinciding with that group that's identified as highly effective in the evaluation. But I can certainly look at that intersection and see what percentage of teachers would fall into these buckets on an either or. My sense from doing these analyses in the past is it's only marginally going to increase that percentage that you're seeing in the evaluation.
Yeah, but I understand, and that's in line with what I was wondering as well. It would perhaps increase that percentage that we're seeing for the evaluation a little bit. It's certainly not going to go down because it's an or. I have a follow-up question, which I don't know that you have the answer to today. I'd be really curious to know, for the EVOS in particular, whether you have that, if we look at the percentage, for example, for 3 out of 5 years, whether you have that broken out by low-performing schools versus those that are not low-performing.
I do not, but these are things that we've looked at before, and this goes back to what I prefaced the conversation with Dr. Locklear's question, is we have done these kinds of analysis of distribution of effectiveness in low-performing versus high-performing schools. And what we do find is there's about a 4 percentage point difference on average between the number of highly effective teachers in low-performing schools versus high-performing schools. So they do exist. So I think one of the misconceptions about EVOS is teachers that are in low-performing schools don't meet expectations of growth, or they're disproportionately lower in meeting expectations of growth, and that is not the case. There are very, very many teachers that are exceeding growth in schools that serve populations of students that are not meeting grade level proficiency.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. If we, unless there's a immediate paramount question, if we could go back, Dr. Evans, to the PowerPoint to go through the rest of the pathways document, because I think we're going to come back to these questions in the next phase, next step. But thank you, those are outstanding questions.
And I'll just keep moving through the hold harmless pieces. Nothing has changed there. Then we're going into the advanced teacher licenses. And you can see some of them, the same language from license 4. And that's the last slide. Are there any particular questions or any slide that anyone wants to discuss?
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Any questions before we transition, or comments? Or please put things in the chat if you need to. So Dr. Evans, if you would pull up the blueprint statement document.
Sure.
And you have this in the materials for the meeting. Enlarge that.
I absolutely will.
Thank you. And with apologies to writers on the commission, the use of the word blueprint was to give my brain a organizing metaphor. That is not a critically important term. But I do want to connect this document, these statements, to the discussion that we just had and that we have had in prior meetings, as this hopefully being a synthesis and representative of those discussions. So as we look down the road toward the work that the State Board of Education would need to do relative to Pepsi's responsibilities with the pathways, the intent of these 10 statements is to provide structural overarching language about the areas of work, questions to be addressed, specific components to be developed that are reflective of the structure and the details that we have discussed in the subcommittees and the conversations that we've had in Pepsi today and the previous two meetings. What I envisioned would happen, particularly as reflected in the questions that people were just asking, is on the State Board of Education side, this gives them direction about what are the critical policy and statute related components that we would need to have in consideration as we're continuing to do the work. On our side, these statements capture clusters of the critical questions, kinds of things that we were just talking about, as well as what are the key components of the work that we need to continue, thinking that we can't do that developmental and revision work in the context of the Pepsi meetings themselves. And so we would go back to using a process that would include work groups or stakeholder groups, expert panels, to more finely develop those components so they can be brought back to Pepsi for us to consider for recommendations. And so we would, around those critical components, we would continue to do that revision work. And the broader work that we have done starts to take on a more specific focus around the critical elements. So what I would like to do is, if we could just take a couple of minutes and just read through the language. And maybe in a minute or so, Dr. Evans, whether people can see them all on the screen. Do the 10 statements capture that structure is what the intent of this document is. So questions, comments, critique? I caught a few typos as I was, apologize for that. We'll clean those up.
Chair Dempsey, this is Randy. I'm happy to start us off here.
Sure.
I'm wondering, I don't have the solution here, but something that resonates for me in point number 2, I feel like I'm looking for the word equity to be built into point number 2. Perhaps it's build analysis and assessment of practice from a base of multiple evidence points from practice with responsible and equitable application. So I don't have the solution there. I'm just putting it out there for the group. And I have I'm happy to pause there. I have one other too. So whatever you prefer.
Can you, I'm trying to take notes as we go. I'm sure Dr. Evans is. Your intent, what do you intend by it's not opposition to the word, is to make sure it's clear on intention?
Yeah, my intention is to ensure we're considering equity within this blueprint. And I think we could add it in multiple points, but at a minimum, point number 2 seems to be an important place to explicitly make mention of equity.
Okay. Thank you. And Dr. Penfield, just as you had asked the question you did in the last meeting and then the discussion today, assuming the state board would positively receive this document as a structural statement, the questions we were just talking about with evidence of student learning and teacher successful practice falls under this statement. We've got to be able to design that system that allows us to be able to, with integrity, answer the questions that just got asked.
And as you just mentioned, the word that I was going to propose as well, if it's okay, I'd like to make another suggestion. I think it's under point number 5, create and adopt valid and reliable tools to analyze and assess practice and its impact. And then I'm wondering that the sub-sentence under that, a cornerstone of the professional knowledge base and the ability to make explicit the practices that positively impact student learning. And I feel like in there, the word evidence, and you just used that word too, as supported by evidence. And I don't know the best place to put it in there. I do think it's important, though, that we make explicit that we're going to engage in evaluating impact using approaches that are supported by evidence. So again, I'm not the best wordsmith out there. I don't know if it's tacking it on to the end of that statement of a cornerstone of the professional knowledge to have supported by evidence. I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah. Dr. Evans, if we can just add that there, I think for the purposes of the document, I think it captures it. For the work to come, we play that out in finer detail. Thank you, Dr. Penfield.
Dr. Dempsey, this is Scott. Does this blueprint adequately communicate that we would expect other forms or other tools and other evidences of effectiveness beyond EVOS and standardized tests? The examples we've given so far, we heard from Tom, are of EVOS. I asked the question earlier of the meaning of other tools designed to measure effectiveness. But I don't see it explicitly stated here. And then I have a second question or recommendation.
Yeah, the answer to that question in terms of the way I tried to craft it is yes, because that comes back to Pepsi. So as we are continuing to work through the recommendations, we're deciding in Pepsi that, assuming that would be a critical component, it gets built into the recommendation that ultimately would come out of recommendations that would come out of Pepsi.
Okay, I would just, I'm only speaking for myself, but not want the blueprint itself to be misconstrued as narrowly defining how we would measure effectiveness. Second is around number 9, build and fund a compensation and reward model. There's been a lot of conversation about whether or not, and discussed in previous PEPSIC meetings about whether or not this is a merit pay model, which I don't think is the intention. But to use both the words compensation and reward, I think may misconstrue the intention here. And I wonder if the use of reward in that sentence was intentional, where compensation might be adequate.
I mean, the answer to your question is we certainly can. I think the answer is we can certainly delete it if that's a very good point. I was channeling conversations that I was in, subcommittee discussions or reading minutes, that the word, I don't think the intention of what I heard and wrote was reward as in merit pay. It was rewarding professionals for their work. But I think that your suggestion to delete it clarifies that.
Yes, thank you. I think I'm hearing agreement that we are in favor of forwarding a framework and a model that honors the teaching profession and adequately compensates our teachers. I think that the word reward may just misconstrue that meaning a little bit. So if there's no other opposition to it, I would remove it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
This is Connie. I had the same comment that Scott did, so I have my hand raised that mentioned that also about the reward, because it really goes back to merit pay. And that's what we're trying. We said this is not a merit pay model. But also there was let me find it. I've lost my train of thought. I'll come back.
That's good. I appreciate you. I'm sorry I missed it, that you had raised your hand. In those statements 9 and 10, where one statement is about the compensation model, and then number 10, which is about supporting the infrastructure. And I tried to be clear. This was my effort to capture conversations that we've had, like the one we just had about the number. Are we going to have those advanced teacher role positions to be able to bring integrity to the model? That 10th statement is an effort to say, number one, we have to adequately support the infrastructure fiscally, but we also have to support its components. And so that is an effort to give direction that when this comes back to Pepsi, we've got to put language to that need that has been addressed around having enough people in positions that support different components of the model. So it's captured under that statement with 10. From my understanding of the work subcommittees, particularly budget and compensation, had done, you've got to fund the components as well as the infrastructure holistically. So compensation is a part of a broader need, but compensation is certainly a signature need.
So my question is this is Connie again. The blueprint for action is what we're agreeing, we're going to have conversation about, and it's to go back to the state board. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, my request at the end of the meeting, once we've done what we're doing right now, is to move the document to the state board so it becomes their direction from us as to the work Pepsi will continue to do, in part connected to what the state board needs to do relative to the identification of statute and policy that may be impacted by this.
And back to that question, when you started talking, that was my second comment, was about number 10 as it relates to discrete components. I think we need to add, I think maybe we're aware what that is, but I think we need to be add clarity to that, because as it relates to all of these impacts of this, we've got to have funding to support, as you stated, in those various capacities. So I don't know if additional wording needs to be added there to outline those components, or is it well defined? Do you think that they will understand that, or do you think this is enough? I'm just wondering.
I certainly, if we need it, certainly we need to be clear. So I appreciate your point. I would say there's a general understanding among people in the state board, based on the conversations last week, what discrete components means. But if we need to, because the language that you've offered or questions you've asked several times, I think if we need to say there, including adequate professional positions to support the model. I mean, we can be, I think we don't want to get too much into the detail, because that's what's over in the other document. In the pathways document, but I think we can certainly clarify on number 10 if you'd like to recommend that language or offer that language.
Hey guys, this is Bill. With components 9 and 10, I believe this structure breeds conversation when we talk about adequate compensation. That it would also, I know during budget compensation subcommittee had a lot of conversation about pay for administrators and other support personnel that go along with our teaching professionals. Is that something that would need to be added in as far as support for our other employees from this document?
This is Marcy. I want to echo and maybe even expand a little bit on what Bill is sharing. For years and years and years, I mean, as long as I've been in the profession, the salary schedules of our teachers and our student support services and others have always been somewhat attached to one another. People have understood that. They've understood how all of the pieces kind of fit together. And I realize that this is one piece of that puzzle, but to talk about this absent of acknowledging in this blueprint that work needs to be done alongside of this or immediately on the tail end of this, that your student services personnel and your administrators and your other salary schedules and your other structures need to be looked at and addressed as well, because to leave those groups behind, whether intended or not, is perceived as devaluing those groups in some way in the roles that they play in public education. And I'm not speaking from my perception or my perspective, but I've heard it enough from others that I just feel like I need to be that voice here. And I think Bill's trying to do that as well. Because I think that for a long time, other groups have gotten things that then the teachers have not gotten. So it's this fine balancing act between the two. But I think to not include something of at least recognizing that that's got to happen from us as a group and part of this would be lacking on our part. It's not strategic, because that silos this work and leaves everybody else out. And I don't think we would ever expect our educators and our administrators to be operating in silos, and we certainly shouldn't give we shouldn't model that in this work either.
Could we? I'm thinking through the conversations on the statute side with what Ms. Schaefer shared earlier on what the charge is to Pepsi, and then the broader importance of what folks just pointed to. The specific charge relates to teaching professionals, so I don't know that limits it, but it speaks specifically to that part of the educator profession. The seems what's critical about, because other groups have also raised the same question to me as the chair of Pepsi, that what does this mean for other educators outside teaching specifically? And it seems to me in part people are asking people are saying we need to address that broader compensation question about the profession more generally, but we also want to make sure those people are supported in ways that make successful teaching more likely, because you have those support roles and those connector roles like school leaders. So to go back to a couple of previous comments, if in number 10 we said in its discrete components, including the necessary professional roles and support for educators more broadly, something like that doesn't take it. If the state board were to come back and say, it sounds like you're getting over into things we didn't ask you to do. But, our recommendation, I don't know if Ms. Schaefer is still on, but our recommendation back can be the language that we feel like we need to offer as a commission.
So, Dr. Dempsey, I can certainly support that. I don't know that it necessarily needs to be part of one of these action steps related to this pathway model, but maybe in an introduction or in a summary, just say that we as a commission recognize that this is specific to this charge, but at the same time, we recommend and support that other work go on to address all of the other professions that support our public schools. And not, because I agree with you. I don't want to try to push it into this, because I think this is so very specific. But I think that if we don't voice, at least for me, an expectation that the others not be left behind or left out in any way, that something be done, at least a recognition of it, that's what I think is important for me as a commission member. That we step out in front and say, we recognize that this is very limited in scope when you look at the full picture, and we want other work to happen. Does that make sense? Am I completely out in left field, which may happen? I feel that way sometimes. So I appreciate you listening.
No, it's a question that has come to me from educator stakeholder groups other than the teaching profession. What if we're focusing this way on teachers, what does this mean for other educator roles? So the question has come up. I have meetings with groups as the chair that they want to talk about their distinct educator role relative to this work around teaching. So it's a really important point. And yes, I unless I'm told otherwise, can articulate that to the state board on behalf of Pepsi.
Yeah, guys, this is Bill again. That was kind of my point, that I understand it may not be part of this document, but this document would breed a lot of conversation with all of those support people that are just as important as each individual. So I think when you're talking budgeting, you have to be prepared to take care of others around if things move forward in that direction.
Sorry, Bill. Connie, I agree with that statement, and I also think about all of our individuals that are going to be working in licensure and the additional work that this is going to add to them. And also as our teacher leaders, as they may want to move from that teacher leader capacity to another role, how will that impact them? We're not wanting teachers to leave the classroom, but all of us at some point were teachers and we moved from that capacity to another leadership role. So we want to make sure that we support that transition if, with compensation as well.
Yes, thank you. Any other suggestions or thoughts on the language?
Dr. Dempsey, this is Tom Tomberlin, if I may offer a comment.
Yes.
So this question is a very important one, and I think I would refer all commission members to the superintendent's Polaris project, where human capital issues is a major component of that. And in that document, it recognizes the kind of primary work of what's going on with educators, teachers, classroom teachers in particular, but it recognizes the need for this kind of reform effort for these other groups we're talking about, chiefly administrators, student instructional support personnel, and even classified staff that without whom no learning could transpire in the classroom. So this progression of this work is recognized in the superintendent's Polaris project, and unless I'm misunderstanding, is slated to begin once we get this one off the ground. And so we have plans to keep Pepsi very busy for the next few years related to these issues.
I have a question for Tom. What you just mentioned, this is Ann, what you just mentioned, this project, what authority is that under, or what is that running under?
So that's under the superintendent's plan for a variety of educational changes. It's called Project Polaris, and I would invite all Pepsi members to take a look at that, about how we're trying to reform various areas of the educational sector.
So is it more like a strategic plan, Tom, or is it more like when you first said it, I was thinking it was something else.
This is Catherine. This is Catherine. I can speak.
Great.
Yeah, Operation Polaris is my strategic plan for the Department of Public Instruction in considering what is and is not under our purview. And one of its 4 satellites is human capital.
Thank you.
So would it be reasonable to, Dr. Dempsey, in your presentation of this to the state board, acknowledge Ms. Truitt's Polaris project and how, because I think the commission ongoing legislatively has a responsibility to look at policies and things, which will come through, I assume, in tandem with Polaris and what's going on with that work. Would it not be appropriate to recognize that and include that as part of our acknowledgement to the other groups in this work?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Any other thoughts or comments before?
Dr. Dempsey, I have one. This is Craig Smith. Good morning, everybody. On number 10, maybe consideration of including the terms to support the infrastructure of the framework in all schools, just given the nature of some of the non-traditional schools that are within our state, whether that's lab schools, obviously charter schools. I think it's important also as we continue with this work to make sure that we are taking into account some of the unique needs, statewide, but also making sure that all schools that fall under DPI's supervision are included.
That is a good suggestion, and to connect it to other conversations that have occurred in this process, all schools and districts. One of the questions that's come up is back to the equitable, the concern about this being equitable, the concern that smaller or more resource challenged districts have to be able to have the capacity to engage this work. So infrastructure framework, your suggestion was for all schools, and then I added districts. Are you okay with that?
Absolutely, yes.
Dr. Evans, can we insert that in 10?
Can you repeat that, Mr. Smith?
Sure, and obviously jump in, Dr. Dempsey, to supplement, but secure funding to support the infrastructure of the framework in all schools and districts.
Okay.
Dr. Dempsey, back to number 10, are we going to outline discrete components, or is that something you will just discuss when you meet with them?
I think that will come from the as we develop the specific recommendations that will come out of this and go back to the State Board of Education, that we would address in the discrete components what they are, what we have talked about in the development through the subcommittees, and then in Pepsi, and then the further work. We would be specific on we would name those components. Because there's a broader infrastructure that sits outside schools and districts at state level, for example, in the licensure and credentialing process that isn't situated necessarily in a school or in a school district. So that infrastructure word is intended to capture those discussions that have occurred out of the subcommittees. But I don't anticipate, as this is read by the state board, that they would be literal in the sort of tightly literal in the language. I think based on the conversations last week, the broad intent of this is what they heard. But yes, we will do that refining of what discrete components are. If there are no other questions or comments, pause for a second to make sure. The action that we need to take, to go back to the beginning of this part of the agenda, is consideration of forwarding this document to the State Board of Education as a statement of the summary of our work thus far. Also, forward to the State Board a request that from this summary, they begin to determine statutes and policies that would be impacted by the work that Pepsi is doing. And third, they would give us direction on the development of potential implementation of recommendations that we would address. So we would be able to start developing implementation language that can be part of the recommendations that go back to the State Board of Education. Are there any questions about those three action components? At this point, I'll entertain a motion from the commission to proceed in that direction. Dr. Evans?
Yes, Dr. Dempsey.
I'm not sure if I was heard or there is no motion.
I heard you.
Okay.
Hey, man, I would say that I would.
I'm Sam Houston. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I so move.
Second, Aaron Fleming.
Motion has been made and seconded. Are further discussion? And Dr. Houston, your motion is all three components of that request?
Yes, as stated. Right.
Thank you.
I was trying to do it earlier. I couldn't get off mute. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Any further discussion?
Dr. Dempsey, this is Scott again, and I'm going to go back to my very first question from the meeting. And until today, I've been relatively quiet in the meetings, respectful of the work that's been done. This is just my third meeting, even though I've been following this for quite a while. I just want to say I very much support this work. I think we very much need to propose to our state board and to our legislature a model for significant increase in compensation. But as you've heard throughout my questions, I am concerned about this becoming a model that relies too heavily on standardized tests as an outcome measure of effectiveness. And I'm not sure that the blueprint for action adequately communicates that we want to be more expansive in our views of it. I don't currently support the framework in its draft form, but I don't want to prevent us from moving forward with the work. I would just want it noted that our passing of the blueprint, not framework, the blueprint, does not necessarily communicate to the state board our endorsement of the framework as it currently is written, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I appreciate what you just expressed. From my role, I am confident that the concern that you just addressed will be addressed by Pepsi, because if there are any to go back to the statute that Ms. Schaefer reviewed with us, that question that you are asking is in that work. So it is making those recommendations out of Pepsi back to the state board as to how to address the issues that your question points to. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And I want to be clear that I appreciate this work and all of the hard work that has gone into getting us to this point. I think it is very important, and we owe it to our teachers to do this and to get it right. I just don't think we are there yet. But if it means continuing the work and being able to lay the groundwork in policy and legislation to give us that opportunity, then I'm in favor of forwarding this blueprint to the state board. I just will encourage my fellow commissioners to remain open-minded, and perhaps when we get into the framework, I can give some specific suggestions for how I think we clarify, simplify, and and broaden the framework in a way to be respectful of many ways of measuring effectiveness. And also in regard to my fellow superintendents who I've heard from extensively here, some concern about the implications for implementation. So if we all remain open to the continued work, then I will continue to be supportive of it. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. And also, go ahead.
I'm sorry, this is Connie. I'm the same with Dr. Elliott. I just want to ensure that we will have additional conversations for many, as it relates to many components of this work. We have done a lot of great work, and as I said last week, or last time we met, pardon me, that sometimes our reality and the theoretical work and reality sometimes don't align. And, you know, as we work towards compiling this, we've run into some situations that we need to address. And I do appreciate the fact that I'm part of this work. I appreciate everyone's work on here, but I do think there are some concerns, and I just want to make sure that we're addressing those concerns. So my question is, if we move forward with this, will we have the opportunity to come back and address those concerns that we have, similar to what Dr. Elliott said?
Yes, I mean, and I will say this with confidence as the chair, that one of the purposes of this document is to communicate to the state board action that we need on their part so that we can and do continue this work. I'm confident this work will remain in Pepsi. We will be responsible to our relationship to the State Board of Education, which is part of the purpose of this document, a signature purpose of the document that's on the screen. But the development of those ultimate recommendations that come out of what we're doing, number one, the work is in Pepsi. Number two, the recommendations relative to policy and statute come from Pepsi. So I can tell you with confidence, yes, that work will continue to be done by Pepsi. This is a step in that process.
Mr. Chairman, this is Aaron Fleming.
Yes,
I want to also say that Dr. Elliott's comments are very valid and certainly understand those concerns. I've talked to him and many of my other colleagues on this, and I think what we're doing today is really just setting up I guess it's like building a house, and we're just kind of framing it a little bit. But I can assure everyone that we will continue to have these conversations, and this really is a living document in some ways, because as we know more and as we get further into the weeds and learn more about the rulemaking process and what we need to do and what the State Board of Education needs to do and what legislative requests there are, we have to keep in mind too that our state superintendents working with many stakeholders on a new accountability model, which you mentioned earlier. And so that may change this a little. So I don't want anyone to get concerned that this is something that is, going to be implemented in the next 3 weeks, and that's just the way it is. And I do appreciate the chairman's work with the State Board of Education last week, and I know he is probably staying up a lot later at night even than I am working on this. And so I appreciate his efforts as well, because we do talk quite a bit about this. And so with all that said, I do want, because I know there's probably a large number of individuals listening in that, and particularly those that are my colleagues working as local superintendents, that we're going to continue to work on this. And I've received a lot of questions that what I would say are in the weeds, but they're concerns from HR directors, finance officers, superintendents, and others, principals. You have my promise, if that counts for anything, that we will continue to work on this. And I look at this action more as a, like I said, just building the infrastructure a bit.
Mr. Chair, this is Catherine.
Yes.
Yeah, I recently asked Dr. Green, our principal of the year, how many teachers he has, and the answer was 56 in his high school. And I said, how many of them teach a tested subject? And he said 6. So, as has been mentioned, that fact is part of the calculus for the need to change our school performance grade / accountability model. And it also shows that we must, it's not an if, it's a must have, as number 5 says, more valid and reliable tools to analyze and assess practice and its impact on student learning, as supported by evidence. We do not have a choice but to continue this work. It's not finished, and the intent has always been to have other measures in addition to EVOS that teachers can select from to show their effectiveness, and to show that, as Maureen Stover always says, that a student is better at the end of the year than the beginning of the year for having had this particular teacher. And I am very excited about continuing this work alongside PUPSI and the State Board of Education, as I know Dr. Tomlin, Dr. Evans, and DPI staff are. It is crucial that we get this right, and I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that we are on the right path to do so.
Thanks, Superintendent.
Hey, Van, I have a question. This is Ann. I'm listening to the hesitancy, and I agree. Dr. Elliott made a great comment. So my question would be this. I know we have a motion on the table, but what would be why waiting a month to let what we've done today marinate and think about it again before we send it forward? What would that do to the bigger timeline besides delay of 30 days?
One, keep in mind there are two dynamics, Dr. Bullock. I think one is this document is a summary document. It isn't the document that is in the hands of PEPSI. The pathways document is number one. Number two, the state board they have to be sensitive to timelines that exist because of what the General Assembly controls, right, and what we can get done on the timeline that they're going to be in once the General Assembly's calendar is in motion. So I think that is the issue. That is one of the issues. I also think the question on this document is it's not intended to speak to all the details. It's intended to speak to process. And I do think the document affirms the responsibility of the document and the continued work being in PEPSI. That's determined in statute, and that isn't going to change. The General Assembly could change that, but it isn't going to change in the process in terms of the way we're doing it right now. It is PEPSI's work at the charge of the state board.
Right. So would we be sending this as an update? I mean, I'm thinking the language might be important. I mean,
we're sending it as a summary of where we are structurally at this point in time.
Okay, that's a fair say.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes.
I think the last thing that any of us want is for the General Assembly to move ahead without us. And that is why time is of the essence.
Thank you, Dr. Schroeder. Any other questions or comments? Dr. Evans, I believe we can do a voice vote, and then if necessary, we can do a roll call vote. Is that correct?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yes.
All in favor of the motion and that has been seconded, please signify your vote, please. I'm sorry. Please, if you are in support of the motion, please say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye, Connie.
Thank you.
I'm opposed. It's Ann.
I'm opposed as well. This is Marcy.
This is Craig Smith. I'm opposed.
This is Scott. I am opposed.
Dr. Dempsey, would you like me to proceed with a roll call vote?
I think that may be best to make sure we have a clear.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was going to call for a division of the House on that. Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Evans?
Dr. Blanton?
Opposed.
Dr. Bullock?
Opposed.
Dr. Dempsey?
Aye. Favor?
Dr. Fleming?
Aye.
Miss Edwards?
Aye.
Dr. Graham? I think Dr. Graham is on. Let me see. Maybe he had to leave. I did see him earlier. Dr. Houston? I don't see him on right now. Dr. Locklear?
Oppose.
Dr. Marr? Dr. Elliott?
A respectful no.
Dr. Penfield?
Aye, in favor.
Superintendent Truitt?
Aye.
Mrs. Carper?
Aye.
Dr. Weddington?
Aye.
Dr. Griffin?
Opposed at this time.
Dr. Holland?
Oppose.
Mr. Smith?
Opposed.
And Mr. Patton is not present. It is a tie. I will say that at this point, I will say that Dr. Graham, Dr. Houston, Dr. Marr, they were here at the beginning of the meeting and have left. In fact, Dr. Houston made the motion.
Dr. Evans, in the event of a tie, do you know what the...
I think I will leave that up to Ms. Schaefer, who is still on the call.
Ms. Schaefer.
It has a majority has to approve the motion for it to be approved. So the motion would fail if it's a tie.
I can contact Dr. Graham, Dr. Houston, and Dr. Marr to see what their votes are.
You would do that in real time, or we would await that?
You would need to have them in the meeting in order to vote.
In the meeting, okay.
Mr. Chairman and Dr. Evans is there and Fleming. I think because of where we're at right now, I'll make a suggestion. I don't know if this is a motion, that if we do wait a month, and I do agree with State Superintendent, time is of the essence, but because we're where we're at, I'm going to suggest that we do this again next month. But is there a forum, and I know it would have to be public, this is a public meeting, for individuals to give feedback to maybe have their own red line version of this document, whatever it may be. Is there a way for us to take the next few weeks before we meet again for individuals to submit feedback, and we have this similar discussion again next month with the expectation that we want to get somewhere, that we can move this forward?
Elsa Schaefer again, I would suggest that you have members submit their requested changes to staff, to Dr. Evans, and compile those, and then people can discuss it at the next meeting. You can't have a meeting without it being an open meeting.
Right.
Drafts can be produced and comments can be submitted.
This is Catherine. Sam Houston has just said that he lost the connection. He's trying to get back on.
Thank you, Superintendent Truitt. Does he need the link again?
I will find out.
Okay, thank you. I also contacted Dr. Marr, and he will rejoin soon.
While we are awaiting that, to the suggestion that Dr. Fleming made, even whatever the ultimate result of this is, people can still provide feedback to the commission as a group about ways to enhance the intent of this document, because ultimately that action would have to be taken. We want to make sure we're as clear as possible in how we work with the State Board of Education on the next steps on this. So even if the document were to pass, we would still want that clarification.
And Van, this is Ann. I would also say, and I voted against this going forward, but you would still have the opportunity to give the state board an update of where we are.
Right.
So, I mean, either way, you can still present and say, this is what we're discussing. We expect this to come back next month. We're still working on final details. I mean, I realize people have been called to rejoin the meeting, but I do think that either way, it's not like the state board would not get an update.
Correct.
And I believe that if next month, 2 months from now, whenever it may be, if we find something, again, as state superintendent's working on Polaris and the new accountability model, as we find things, and I realize this isn't the final document, this is just the framework, but as we find things, I certainly would be in favor of amending the document as we need to.
Absolutely.
Dr. Marr and Dr. Houston have rejoined.
And Dr. Evans, can you continue the roll call?
Yes. So Dr. Houston and Dr. Marr, we are voting on the previous motion on the 10 points of action for the blueprint. Sorry about that, blueprint. Dr. Houston, what is your vote? He is
muted.
Dr. Houston, you're muted, and I just sent you a request to unmute.
on our way. This is Allison Schaefer again. If he can't unmute, is for him to send his vote in the chat.
Yes, he's on the phone. So, Dr. Houston, are you able to send your vote in the chat? If so, please proceed.
And Dr. Evans, are there others in the meeting that have not voted?
Yes, Dr. Marr, what is your vote?
I vote yes.
Give Dr. Houston a few more seconds to take action. Also, while we're waiting, to continue Dr. Fleming's point, the questions that people have asked in the discussion, and that I've seen some comments in the chat, that is the work that comes next. And so concerns commission members might have about how to develop particular components of the model is what we need to turn into what we need the recommendations to be, such that those concerns are addressed. That work is will remain in Pepsi. And our work and responsibility is to answer our own questions in terms of the way we frame the recommendations.
And for what it's worth, I saw Dr. Elliott's comment about measures of student learning. He is absolutely right that it was a complete failure. I just saw his comment, but I do want to say, unlike that with this, I think stakeholder feedback and comments from this entire committee will help that along. And as we see issues, we correct them. As I recall, with measures of student learning, it was sort of just pushed out by the department, and we had to figure out how to implement it. And I think this is going to be a little different than that. But I did want to acknowledge his comment, because that's not something we want to live through again.
So I will say for Dr. Houston, since he's on the phone, it looks like I can't chat with him, so I'm not sure he can type in the chat.
The current vote, Dr. Evans, if you could share that with the commission.
So there's 7 no's and 8 yeses.
Right. Ms. Schaefer, because we have a person in the meeting where he has not yet registered a vote, what's our responsibility to his vote?
If he can't make his vote, then it would not be registered. And that's just the way it needs to be public.
Hey, Dr. Houston. Okay, hold on just a second. I'm gonna put Dr. Houston on speakerphone so he can speak to the group. Here you go, Dr. Houston.
I vote yes.
Thank you, Dr. Houston.
Sorry, but I lost 3 different connections to you at one time.
That is okay. Thank you very much.
This is Ann. I have a question for Ms. Schaefer. We have a lot of people listening to our meetings, and I just want to make sure what we just did by calling people and asking them to rejoin the meeting, no matter the vote, this isn't about the outcome. Is that allowed in meeting protocol? Because I just wonder if we're going to get what people I mean, I'm asking myself that same question.
Well, with regard to Dr. Houston, he was knocked off for electronic reasons.
Okay.
It wasn't that he wasn't trying to attend the meeting. I didn't hear any details about why Dr. Moore was not there, but Dr. Houston was attempting to be in the meeting, and it was a technological issue. So I think, in all fairness, that's not to count his vote. It would be appropriate to count his vote under that circumstance.
Okay, thank you. I think that just needs to be said, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand that, but I don't think it's fair for him to not be counted because he had issues beyond his control technologically. He was trying.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Bullock. I think that all of the commissioners in the Zoom have voted, Dr. Evans?
That is correct.
And the final vote is 9 in favor, 7 opposed.
That is correct.
Then the motion passes.
Yes.
And thank you all for the deliberative nature of that conversation and raising critical questions and concerns as we move forward. So I will, on behalf of Pepsi, communicate the outcome to the state board chair, and then we will continue to engage in the work we have been doing as we move toward the December meeting. And Dr. Evans, I believe that concludes the business items in the agenda.
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for the discussion. I remind commission members that our next monthly meeting will be held virtually on Thursday, December the 8th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. We have now completed our meeting, and unless there is additional business at this time, I ask for a motion to adjourn.
This is Scott, so moved.
Thank you. Second.
Connie, second.
Thank you. Motion has been made to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your focus and energy in this important conversation today, and the meeting is adjourned.